Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ibrahim Awad. I'm Professor of Practice in Global Affairs at the School of Public Affairs and Public Policy, GAPP, the American University in Cairo. This is the Tahrir Dialogue number 86, jointly organized by GAPP and by the Tällberg Foundation. And GAPP would like to thank the Tällberg Foundation for this joint organization of the event. On behalf of the Dean of the School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, Dean Nabil Fahmy, and on my own, I would like to welcome the audience and our distinguished panelists. Three of them are already with us. I will present them in detail late in a few minutes. But Dean Fahmy usually would have welcomed you. However, he has preferred not to do that because he is one of the panelists. Our subject today is global order, amidst global disorder. Few occurrences have given rise to and have stimulated debates about the future of the international system as the global COVID-19 pandemic has. This is natural, normal, given the unusual nature of the threat to human beings that originated not from the interstate system, not even from non-state actors, whether licit or illicit, but from a totally new source. A new source has threatened humankind, and therefore these large debates are quite understandable. The debates have raised several subjects. Globalization, understood as a political process. Will it continue as it was a few months ago? Will be a reversal in globalization? Will be a reform in globalization? Distribution of power in the international system. Which powers will be the winners, if any, and who will come on top? The norms and practice in the international system. Will international cooperation be reinforced so that humankind can effectively deal with the new threats, or would there be reversal to nation states' primacy and to antiquated concepts of sovereignty? Related to this is nationalism and populism. Will they be exacerbated? Will they triumph within states' political system, or will democracy and practices of negotiations prevail at the internal and international level? And finally, global order, what we're discussing today. Will there really be a new global world order, or will it be a reversal to status quo ante, whether we have brought the COVID-19 under control? In this webinar, we have 4 distinguished panelists. It is my great pleasure to welcome them. They will address some of the subjects that I raised and many others, since the debates have been extremely wide-scoped. Our first panelist is Jan Eliasson, a prominent Swedish diplomat, until 3 years ago, Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations. Former Sweden's foreign minister, at present the chairman of SIPRI, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. He is also president of the Tällberg Foundation. Alan Stoga is our second panelist. He's a strategist and entrepreneur with extensive experience in geopolitics and in government. He is currently the executive chairman of the Tällberg Foundation. He's also president of Zemi Communication, that provides geopolitical and business counsel to global corporations. Ghassan Salamé is our third panelist. He's an emeritus professor of political science, had the prestigious Sciences Po in Paris, founder and dean for many years of the Paris School of International Affairs, former Minister of Culture in Lebanon, and until very recently, the special representative of the Secretary General of the United Nations in Libya. Last but not least, our fourth panelist is the host of this event. Nabil Fahmy is the Dean of GAPP, the founding of GAPP, the founding Dean of GAPP. He's also a distinguished University of Practice professor at the AUC. He's the former Egyptian foreign minister, former ambassador of Egypt to the United States and to Japan. Of course, with the invitation were attached the detailed resumes of our distinguished panelists. My first question is addressed to Jan Eliasson. In the innumerable comments and analysis of the impact of COVID-19, views are split. Some analysts consider that nothing will change in the international system. These are pessimists that think that things will revert to what they were before, and that the distribution of power will not be affected. Others consider that changes will occur, that will come out with a new configuration of the system and probably new practices in the system. What do you think, Jan Eliasson, about this debate?
Thank you very much, Ibrahim, for inviting me. I'm very glad to join this panel with old friends and colleagues. And to answer your question directly to the points that you made is that I definitely think that changes will have to happen. Going back to the old ways will not happen. I even start to compare this to the 9/11 events, which had a tremendously important effect on so many areas, good and bad, of course. And this will also be the case. We will all have to discuss interconnectedness, interrelationship, interdependence, the degree of such interdependence. We will all have to discuss how prepared we are, how well we are preventing crisis. We will all have to discuss how different actors will have to cooperate together. We will all have to ask ourselves what kind of institutions we need in order to see the road ahead. I found in my big experience that crises bring out both the best in people and nations and the worst. And I think we will have a crossroads situation after the corona. And I think we should talk about it like we do today, already while the crisis is erupting. The one road will be the one of looking inward, putting your own nation's interests first, which of course is natural when your population is hit, but you can never forget the world outside, and looking forward, or whether we will look backwards and we will look backwards in time and go back to the old. And I would say that it's crucial that we now bring out the importance of interdependence, the importance of better preparedness, and that this type of action is something that has to be driven by all actors. It's not only governments and international organizations like UN and European Union, it's also academic institutions like yours, think tanks, civil society, the parliaments, the private sector will all have to be involved in informing this future. So if in the best of cases we take out the best of our intentions, we should also revise some of the views that we have had in the past. Some of the aspects of globalization have not been so positive as many had hoped. We have, in my country, a discussion about privatization and deregulation, whether that was the right thing to do. So this type of being very self-critical is, of course, very important in this process. Then last point to make is that we already have changes. I think the growing difficulty in the relationship between China and the United States is going to be, is already very serious. But if this continues in this way, it will constitute a geopolitical change of some magnitude and would almost be compared to creating a new Cold War situation if we go this road. Especially troubling is that if it is also driven by domestic concerns, and I'm sure Alan will enter that. From Europe's perspective, we have a stress test of our cooperation, because when Italy asked for support, they didn't get the support. And we still have a big problem with our big financial crisis program. So it's going to be a stress test for both Europe, and I think United Nations also, particularly with the steps taken by the United Nations, will be in a very difficult situation. The steps that are taken vis-a-vis United Nations from the President of the United States are very troubling. Not only earlier leaving the climate change agreement and so forth, but also recently appointing WHO as a problem and even an enemy. So altogether, I think we have a chance to use this COVID-19 crisis to try to create an order which is better than in the past. When I was Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, we had a principle that we used after the earthquakes and different natural disasters. We said, we must build back better. Build back better is exactly what we have to do after Corona. Thank you, Brad.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And Eliasson, you come out, I think, as expected, as an optimist. An optimist.
A worried optimist,
of course, being steeped in multilateral cooperation, having worked for the United Nations Foreign Minister of Sweden, of all countries. This is quite reassuring. Alan Stoga, you are an eminent expert in geopolitics. Many analysts, including American analysts, say that the United States at present is neither capable nor willing to lead the world, to assume the charge of leadership of the world as it has since 1945, and that in fact this unwillingness is not only unwillingness from President Trump or from his constituency, but in fact that it is shared across the board in the United States. And this, of course, is to the detriment of multilateralism and international cooperation. You agree with this assessment?
Let me start by caricaturing myself. If Jan is a worried optimist, I'm a hopeful pessimist. But that said, I want to thank you, Ibrahim, and thank you, Nabil, for doing this today, and more generally for the cooperation between GAPP and the Tällberg Foundation. I think it's precisely this kind of cooperation that we need now more than ever, as we think, as Jan suggested, as we think through what kind of world do we want, because we know we don't want the world we have. This is, in my view, the first really big test of globalization, and we're failing. We're failing about as badly as you can fail on almost all counts, political, economic, health point of view. So this question of what world do we want, you mentioned, Jan, the thinking that produced the UN system and the Bretton Woods Conference. As you know, that thinking began in 1942, long before the Allies thought they had any chance of winning the war. But they knew if they didn't start thinking early, they would end up exactly as we ended up after 1918, back in the soup. So I think this thinking is terribly important. Ibrahim, to your question about the United States, I'd like to make 4 points just to kick the ball. The first, and I've already alluded to that, is that the global architecture that was essentially designed in 1944, 1945, hasn't changed anywhere near as much as the global realities. Power is dramatically different, the distribution of power. How the economy works is dramatically different. And technology is literally changing the nature of life. Yet we still have this construct that is now 70 years old. It's crazy. We've known, everybody on this panel has known for a long time that we don't need to fiddle with the architecture, we need new architecture. So the first part of my answer to your question as to whether or not we, the Americans, are willing or able to play a dominant leadership role is whether the system itself wants us to or can contain us in any kind of way. It's the wrong system, so we've got to rethink everything. But to the United States, Americans are, which is the second point, Americans are not particularly in a consensus-seeking mood these days. Other than people on this panel, all of our friends in New York and Washington, I think it's fair to say that most Americans today see global engagement as having excess costs and limited returns. That reflects not only a long-standing thread in American thinking and in American politics, go back to the know-nothings, go back to George Washington, but it's all been made worse by the downsides of globalization and what we now think of, encouraged by our president, as an imported pandemic. The implication of an imported pandemic is if you weren't engaged internationally, no pandemic. That's stupid, it's simple, it's simplistic, but the logic of talking about it as an imported pandemic feeds into the notion, wouldn't borders be better? The next point. Did all this start with Donald Trump or does it precede Donald Trump? I would argue that the big inflection point in the American engagement with the global system starts, to Jan's point, immediately after 9/11. The Americans, President George W. Bush's administration, more or less unilaterally decided on a reaction that was a global reaction that involved and changed much of how the world works, that affected the global economy, global power, etc. It was a unilateral decision that was unique even for the Americans in the post-war period. The Obama administration, if you remember, famously pivoted towards Asia. Well, that pivot was actually away from our alliances and allies in the Middle East and in Europe to some extent, towards nothing, because we never completed the pivot. It was a wonderful description of and a more elegant description than certainly the language we hear recently of withdrawing from globalism. But in my mind, it had much of the same characteristics, even if the speechwriters were much better. And of course, the current administration really does feel like they think the world is about 1818, 1820 instead of 1920 in terms of the capacity for the United States to turn inward. Now, the last point I would make right now is completely premature, completely unscientific, but I've been fascinated to listen to the conversation in my country about reopening, and I use air quotes on that. The entire conversation about reopening at the moment is about barbershops, is about baseball games, is about the local restaurant. No one is talking about the need to reopen borders, to reestablish global supply chains, to engage internationally, to get on an airplane and go somewhere, to actually talk to people other than through the miracle of this Zoom link. I think too many Americans would be delighted if instead of a pivot towards more globalization, this pandemic produced a pivot towards more localization. And local, I don't even mean the nation, I mean at the local level. We're rediscovering our localism, not rediscovering our globalism at this point. Now, I'm hoping that there's lots of Americans on this call, in this meeting, that will say, Alan, you're crazy. We really know we need to be engaged internationally. And of course, I share that. I'm a globalist, we are globalists. We know that the first best is a global solution. I'm just really quite afraid that my country is moving towards the second or third best, which is the opposite of that global solution. Let me stop there, Ibrahim.
Thank you very much, Alan. Thank you so much. In fact, you have confirmed that the reversal from globalization started after 9/11, started with President George W. Bush, and that there is no doubt about the benefits of multilateralism or international cooperation, that it presents more costs than it does produce benefits. And you said that there is a reversal not only towards the nation but towards the local level. And in contrast to Jan Eliasson, who said he was a worried optimist, you are a hopeful pessimist, which probably touch each other, converge at a certain point. Now we welcome Ghassan Salamé, who just joined us. Ghassan Salamé, you're most welcome to this Tahrir Dialogue 86, and you have just heard Alan Stoga talk about a reversal toward local and not only the national level of production of political discourse, of political debate. Let me ask you, do you really think that we are getting back to nation states that are closed onto themselves? Are we getting back to nationalisms, to a concept of sovereignty, that sovereignty in the United States, and Alan has made a very pointed observation, the United States, in fact, we see even discussions between the federal government and governors about the competences of each. What do you think? Are we retreating from international cooperation towards nation state and nationalism and populism? What is where is the future? Is it for populism, nationalism, or is it for international cooperation?
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. I am happy to see friends in this webinar. Let me say that the key for me right now is to make a much more serious distinction between international cooperation and globalization. I think, I fear that the confusion between the two concepts is going to be detrimental to both. Globalization is something and international cooperation is something else. Globalization is a process more or less regulated by the states, or at least by the most influential among them, that leads to a number of things that are very good, like decreasing the number of poor people in China, but also to a number of negative effects, like the loss of jobs in many countries, like the transfer of technology through spying, like all kind of things, like more pollution, like all that is crossing a border without authorization or with a sort of resignation of the state authority is globalization. International cooperation is something else. International cooperation is a voluntary acceptance that no states can solve problems on their own. And therefore they need to have treaties, to have conventions, to have international organizations to somehow organize their cooperation in order to have it a win-win situation. And what I'm afraid of these days, looking at the international conversation on these issues, is that precisely the nationalists you just mentioned tend to confuse the two concepts together. They are in fact anti-globalists, and in their way, they start also saying that they don't want any kind of international cooperation. That's exactly what Orban, for example, is saying. That is what others are also saying. I think the next few weeks and months will compel us to have a higher level of international cooperation, but also to listen more to those who are suffering from the bad or negative effects of globalization. This is something, and this is something else. The other thing I'm extremely worried about is that when we say we need more authority to people to protect us, are we ready to sort of give away our freedom in order to be better protected? If I look at the polls, there was one poll yesterday mentioned by Garton Ash in The Guardian that 53% of Europeans now believe that authoritarian governments are better than democratic ones to sort of stand up to this kind of pandemics, this is something that makes me think. Are we ready really to sacrifice freedom for more protection? Because this is the key if we want more effective states. And I think one of the big debates that we will not be able to avoid in the next few weeks, to what extent authoritarianism has been better than democratic governance in dealing with the pandemics. I have my doubts. I truly have my doubts about that. The third problem we will need to face is to what extent we all believe in homo economicus, in the sense that what we are hearing everywhere now, that we will not die necessarily from COVID-19, but we will die from hunger if we don't die from the virus, because the whole economic apparatus is at a standstill. To what extent the protection of our health, of our well-being, needs to be dominated by our economic plans and economic activity, and to what extent we can somehow put between brackets our economic plans in order to sort of implement the Aristotelian principle of precaution when it comes to public health. This is also a debate that is dividing people, dividing governments, dividing everybody. What I see, and this is my last observation, is that states are weaker everywhere. They are weaker and they are resigning to the fact that they will need local powers everywhere. Mayors. In France, where I am now confined, Macron is talking to mayors and asking mayors to take over. Governors in the United States, local powers in some large third world countries. But this is not a planned thing. This is something that shows more the weakness of the state than the empowerment of the local authorities. And it is not a solution to the fact that we still need a higher level of international cooperation in the weeks and months to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ghassan Salamé. I don't know whether you don't have your video on purpose. Maybe our audience would like to see you speak.
No, not on purpose, not on purpose. I don't know what happened. I will see.
But we heard you well.
We heard you very well, and thank you very much for your observations. And in fact, one observation extremely interesting that the states, this assumption or this assertion about the return of the nation state. In fact, nation states have proven weak everywhere and have had shortcomings everywhere. So this, in fact, goes to answer the claim of the return of the nation state. You have also talked about the local level, exactly in ways similar to what Alan said. But at the beginning, you distinguished between globalization and international cooperation, and you pointed out shortcomings of globalization. Let me ask Nabil Fahmy about shortcomings in the global system. It has been said that, in fact, the COVID-19 has not created new problems. In fact, it has revealed problems that already existed in globalization, that already existed in the global system. So my question to Nabil is, what are examples of these shortcomings at the international and at the national level, since globalization includes these two levels? What can you identify as shortcomings and fragility?
Well, thank you, Ibrahim. And let me just at the beginning state how honored I am to be on the panel with the three other panelists. As you can see from their first comments. They're very insightful people, and they think very deeply. And besides that, they're all friends, but professionally, I'm very honored to be here. The question is extremely important, and let me build on what my colleague said and then answer it directly. We are facing serious macro questions, and we can't give simple, short answers to them. The world order as established was established about 70 years ago and then evolved to a certain degree over time. But the reality on the ground has evolved much more quickly. It was based on the premise that we want to prevent another third world war, and that the world was essentially divided between the vanquished and the vanquished, and then a group of others, including countries like my own non-aligned countries. But in essence, the political culture at the time was a balance of power. You gain influence through power, and the balance of power is what swayed the decision. As the realities on the ground changed from a bipolar world to a unipolar world to a multipolar world, regrettably, the balance of power has not changed. And we are missing a point, which I'm sure both Ghassan and Jan have felt very deeply because they've worked within the UN. The UN was based on the dream of collective action. From the very beginning in the preamble, it talks about we the people. And then it goes on to talk about collective defense and so on and so forth. Now, it's that collective part that we haven't developed. We continue to work on the basis of a political culture that is based on power. Well, power is now being defined differently, and we can't consequently work on the former basis. I say this because as a result of what's happened, I don't think everything that happened was bad, but as a result of what happened, we lost the social conscience of the world order. That's what's really missing. We don't look out for others. When one looked at figures on the ground, the coronavirus did not differentiate between rich and poor. It hurt the wealthiest as well as the poorest. It hurt the strongest militarily as well as those who are weakest militarily. But how can a nation be so powerful militarily? And how can competitive nations talk about mutually assured destruction, but not have a health system that enables them to qualify, to deal with these kinds of crises? They invest multifold in destructive capacity, but not multifold in the health and capacity of their own people. That's really what's missing here. I can give you other examples. The difference between rich and poor in each of our countries and then between our countries. The magnitude of difference is astonishing. It's again, I'm not a moralist, but when you get into the figures that we see these days, it's really a point where it goes beyond what is socially acceptable. Now, how do we resolve that? Not by limitations. No, you resolve that by, again, changing the culture. So we deal with these issues in a collective fashion. And I'd like to argue one point, and I'll come back a bit later on something else. I listened recently to an interesting forum and a presentation where one of the world-known economists, Mohammed Arian, spoke, and he mentioned the balance economically between resilience and efficiency. Well, if you take that globally or politically or by way of security, we're going to all have to look at this. How much do you need to keep to yourself? How much can you reach outside for the sake of efficiency? At the end of the day, the challenges that existed post-World War II are different from what exists today. And we need to deal with the system in a different fashion. I really think we need not to destroy the UN, but to build the UN into a more robust institution. But again, it's not only the multilateral or regional institutions, it's about our own political culture.
Thank you very much, Nabil. Let you pointed out questions of inequality, social and economic questions, and questions that were generated by globalization, and not only by globalization, by economic policies that have gone in parallel with globalization and supported the globalization. So let me go back to Jan Eliasson. You have heard Ghassan Salamé talk about shortcomings of globalization. Globalization is not international cooperation, as he said. Alan mentioned that we need, in fact, a new architecture, that the architecture that came about after 1945 is not suited to the world of today and the distribution of power. Nabil has just said that the UN needs to be rebuilt. So what do you think? You have been in intergovernmental machinery, but you have been also in Secretariat as Deputy Secretary General. What way can the UN go? Not only the UN organization, but the UN system as a whole. WHO has been accused, but when it did not have a mandate to do what it was asked or was supposed to do. What do you think? In which direction should the institutional system go in order to address possible threats?
Well, I think it was good of Ghassan to point to making a distinction between international cooperation and globalization. I think we need to look very critically at how globalization has evolved since the 80s. Certainly there has been tremendous gaps in its distribution of income and wealth, both inside nations, even more inside nations than between nations. And that's why I use the expression, we need to build back better and take out the best parts of interdependence and international cooperation and bring it into the positive discussion of international cooperation. I think one one aspect which has to be taken seriously is that in today's world, military security was dominating the work on security. Hard security was a dominant factor. Soft security was considered very soft, if you see what I mean. In today's world, if we don't recognize that the huge gaps are a security problem, and that we don't recognize that pandemics is a security problem, we don't recognize that climate change is a security problem, then we will miss the point. And I think it's tragic that the Security Council did not now pick up these aspects of seeing security and the wider aspects. Both China and the US were against even Secretary General's proposal to have ceasefires in relationship to the fight against the pandemic, as Ghassan probably knows from the Libya front. I think this is pathetic. I was Deputy Secretary General when we made sure that Ebola became a Security Council issue. And it has a special weight when it comes from the Council, binding decisions. It's not recommendations. General Assembly was better, and I think Guterres is doing well also in bringing that point. But you know, when you have direct resistance from the United States on one of the most important institutions now, it's really it's a big shock, and the UN is really fighting hard to recover from that. One point I'd like to make, which I think is extremely interesting, is the state going to be weaker or stronger? I have grown up in social democratic Sweden with a strong state, strong institutions, trust in institutions, so forth. But since the globalization of the late 80s onward, we have had, even in my country, as Alan knows, who's followed this very closely, we have had a tremendous amount of deregulation and privatization. And what has happened is that when the privatization and deregulation is taking place for functions that are the public sector's responsibility, then you lose accountability. There's no way to turn. Who is responsible if you privatize things? And so that is one of the reasons why you have this growing mistrust among nations. Interesting enough, the public opinion polls in Sweden now are very much in favor of the Social Democrats who are in power. Have gone up about 30–40% in the last 2 months, because they bring back the responsibility of the state for certain functions. And this is going to be even, I don't want this to become an ideological battle, because I think pure efficiency would warrant going the way that I suggested in the beginning, the road of cooperation and the road of building back better. So over to you.
Thank you very much. Anand, Jan had just said that both the US and China were opposed, in fact, to a debate in Security Council of the coronavirus pandemics. But so they were in agreement there. What do you think about the relationship between China and the United States? There is this argument, they sit in this trap that one mounting power and a power that is losing some of its hegemony to another one, which is mounting, are bound to clash, are bound to get to a conflict. What do you think about the relation of, not necessarily of conflict, but what about the relation between these two powers, which are at the helm of the international system at present?
I think that framing that came up from our friends at Harvard has been wrong from the first time that they thought it. This isn't a question of the US and China, it's a question of the global system. We all know that China, this China, was not a participant in the building of this global system. They were not at the table. They were, in fact, after Dr. Kissinger's negotiation in the 70s, when they got the Security Council seat, they sort of inherited a position in the system, but they hadn't built that system. They hadn't been there at the founding. They hadn't been architects, and they rode that system to where they are today. The question, there's at least three questions. One is, does China want to be part of the system that was built in the 40s, or as it's evolved today? And my impression, and I'm sure my colleagues would disagree violently, is the answer is essentially no. That the Chinese have been free riders, certainly on the trade side, largely on the security side. And the mistake we all made was to allow that, and not to force a renegotiation of the system in a way that would have, to some of the points being made in the questions, have recognized the redistribution of power that exists in the 21st century from the distribution of power that existed in the mid-20th century. It is a fundamentally different world. Power is fundamentally differently distributed, yet we've got these antique institutions that don't reflect that. First point. Second point. The issue is, how do you get from there to somewhere else? As I'm sure we all know on the panel, the Chinese had approached the United States a few years ago and said, it's time to rethink the global system. It's time for you and us to sit down, the Chinese and the Americans, and imagine a new world together. And I think appropriately, the Americans, President Obama, said, no, we don't work that way. We are part of this system. We are part of an existing structure, and we want to work with our colleagues and engage you in that structure. Now, put aside whether or not the current administration would have responded the same way. The Chinese haven't asked them, so it's not an issue. But nonetheless, again, the question becomes how, not just do the US and China relate, but how does China relate to a global system as it exists? And secondly, how do we evolve that global system, engaging the Chinese appropriately, not in a bilateral condominium, which was their proposal, but rather in a multilateral renegotiation. And the last point to make right now is, I think we have, and this Jan, now I'm going to join you as the worried optimist. We have an amazing opportunity right now to do this. If any of us had been asked 6 months ago, can you imagine a world where you would have a dramatic consolidation of authority at national levels, where you would have the political will to act in an emergency like this, or where you would put together in Europe and North America 1/3 of your GNP and throw it at a problem? Now, we all would rather throw it at climate change, but we're throwing it at this thing. But that creates an opportunity and a willingness to try to use that collaboration in a way that perhaps allows us to do the rebuilding, redesigning, reimagining of a global system that is fairer, that does reflect current power, that does fully incorporate everybody. And that does, in its process, take power away from some of those that have it. We all know why we have not had Security Council reform, because none of the five want to give up the value of their vetoes. That's certainly true of my country, but it's true of all of the others in the P5, as Jan, you dealt with intimately. So are we at a point where things are messed up enough, where power is concentrated enough, and where the need to change is visible enough, and if we're smart enough to do something with all that? I think that's the challenge on the table.
Thank you very much, Alan. Thank you so much for pointing out the opportunity that exists now to rebuild the system. And I noticed that you talked about the global system and not the international system any longer. So maybe this would be a distinction for the future. But you also said that China does not want to join the system as it is. So the question that I put to Ghassan Salamé is about what is it that is not acceptable to China in the international system? Is it the norms of the system? The norms? What exactly? The cultural norms of the system, more than the security norms of the system? How do you see a system that is refunded, that is rebuilt? On which basis, on which foundations, and whether the opportunity really exists or not?
Thank you. I hope you see me this time.
Yeah.
Yes, I do. Not me myself.
Let me answer the China question first. I have been a bit critical of the way the China issue is getting posed by Western friends in Europe and in particular in the United States. The question has to do with two issues. The first issue, when do you start when it comes to this international system as it is today? Do you start with Bretton Woods? Do you start with 1945? Or a few years earlier in 1942-43, during the Second World War? The Chinese do not start there. The Chinese have a big difference with the Russians. Some of my American colleagues do not see. Russia has been a beneficiary of the expansion of the West in the 18th and 19th century and the building of the international system as it is today. While the Europeans were conquering Africa or Latin America and elsewhere, the Russians were expanding in Central Asia, in Siberia and elsewhere. Russia was part of the concert of Europe, was part of the European system as it was in the 19th century. And then China was a victim of the expansion of the West in the 17th, in the 18th, and in the 19th century, the way the Ottoman Empire was also a victim of the expansion of the West. Russia was to a large extent part of the West. And that is why the Chinese would like you to go there into the 17th and 18th century, where China was not yet defeated by this expansion of Western powers, Russia included in these Western powers. So it's much deeper when you talk to the Chinese than that. The second point concerning China, that is in my view very crucial. There is a big difference between the Western civilization and any other civilization, including the Chinese one, not to mention the Islamic one or others. At one point in the 16th, 17th century, the Western civilization decided that it is a universal civilization, and therefore that is going to produce norms for the individual, for the state. That it produced international law, it produced human rights, it produced so many things that were expected to become universally adopted. The Chinese civilization never thought of itself as a potential universal civilization. That is why there is a much better adequacy between the Chinese cultural picture and the Chinese nationalism. Their nationalism is based on the idea that they do not pretend to produce universal norms and values. While the West is very often taken at its own value contradiction. Haha, are you defending human rights while you are defending such and such dictator? Are you defending international law while you are trying the Bay of Pigs, or I don't know what story that is in full contradiction with international law? The Chinese never positioned themselves to be producer of universal values and norms. That is why they are, I think, more willing to discuss international cooperation with other partners in the world. Now you asked the question, I'm not going to give you a long answer, though the question is very crucial. The question of the international system as it is today. Well, the main threat facing the UN, in my view, is irrelevance and oblivion. When it is not only that you want India, who was not there, or I don't know who, to join the Security Council. This is very legitimate. I don't think that the membership of the Security Council is sustainable in the way it is now. But more importantly, is the Security Council seizing the most important issues in world politics today and trying to deal with them? Where was the Security Council on the Arab-Israeli conflict? Where is the Security Council on the Ukrainian issue? Where is the Security Council on the Syrian issue? Where is the Security Council on the COVID-19 issue? Where is the Security Council on all these issues? If by a lack of power or a lack of will, because the other 13 were not able to impose upon the Americans and the Chinese to discuss COVID-19 and come with a strong resolution concerning this big issue. If for a while you show your inability to put on your agenda the real issues, including the trade issue between the US and China, and so many other issues, if you are unable to bring these issues to your table, nobody will come to your table. And you will be slowly marginalized. And that is what's happening now with the UN. It is not that the Republican senators are criticizing the WHO. Well, we have seen that again, but it was by the same Republican senators of that time. What is more important is that I see that the most important issues in world politics today are not dealt with by the UN. And therefore, if the menu is constrained to a few African conflicts here and there, well, the most important danger now for the UN is to become marginal, is to become outside the main dynamics of international politics.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this this analysis, not only of the nature of China and the nature of Chinese thinking, as opposed to the thinking of the hegemonic powers of the last 2 centuries, and then you assessed the situation of the United Nations, of, I guess, multilateralism as it is, as present, and you say that it could fall into irrelevance because it does not address really the problems that the system faces. So my question to Nabil Fahmy is, how can this be remedied? Or can it be remedied at all first? And if it can, how? How is it that we can preserve the relevance of the United Nations or of any other organization that represents international cooperation? Unmute, Nabil. Nabil, unmute.
Sorry, let me again start by saying the system was not working efficiently, and then it was hit by COVID-19, not the other way around. COVID-19 was a wake-up call. Simple analogy, it's a bit crude. If you touch a live electric wire, if you don't learn not to touch it again, you're going to be in serious trouble. But as a result of what you faced, you try to wake up and do things differently in order not to leave a live wire and to make sure that you don't face these consequences. So my point really here is, if we continue to think the same way we thought 70 years ago, or only work with the institutions that existed 70 years ago, we will fail. There's no way we can get back to semi-normal, not complete normality, but semi-normality, without having some openness of borders, at least for products and also people. But there are much deeper questions, the frustrations that exist within societies or between nations cannot be left unaddressed. My suggestion is the following. All of the people at the table on the panel, except maybe for Alan, who didn't have to suffer through bureaucracies over time, worked in international bureaucracies. The present membership of the Security Council and of the UN, the politics will not allow for creative thinking. They're not going to meet at the Security Council and decide to be collective suddenly. They are not there. My recommendation, therefore, is to try to start the thinking somewhere else, not in the Council, but possibly related to the UN or outside the UN, and then bring it to the Council. Specifically, Secretary General should gather a group of wise people, not in government, and try to work with them to develop themes, concepts, rules, structures for a new world order. He will be criticized vehemently by the powers that be, but then slowly bring these concepts to the member states and try to work them slowly through the system until they start changing their own culture of thinking. If we do not think collectively, we're not going to reach new solutions. And if we do not reach new solutions, we will face other pandemics, other problems, and continue to be unable to respond to them. I would also suggest, for example, why is it that there can be so much money spent, as I said, on the military and not enough for basic care? The expenditure, and SIPRI is an expert on this, is far beyond what's actually needed. How can a rich country be rich if it can't afford healthcare? And frankly, how can a medium-sized country succeed if it can't provide basic needs for its own country, for its own population? And it can't do that except through cooperation. It can't get to cooperation unless there's a different way of thinking. So I would again argue we need to try to develop a concept of a balance of interests. There will still be more powerful people, more powerful countries, and less powerful. But we have to start to develop that the long-term interests of us all is in cooperation, even if we gain different benefits in the short term. And if we cannot start doing that through the UN, we should start doing it outside the UN and then bring it to international organizations, to the UN. And I'm talking here not only about politics, I'm talking about everything from economics to culture to norms. And I would argue there were very interesting questions raised. I would not want to give up personal liberties for the sake in the long term. At the same time, there are requirements when you are facing an emergency. The requirements are not in producing more stringent measures. They're in accepting, all of us, those participating and those enforcing, that this is a collective interest. So again, I will push very hard for changing our way of thinking rather than simply trying to think that changing the structure will change. Changing the structure has to be the second step after changing the way we think.
Thank you very much, Nabil. We have taken an hour now, and the remaining 30 minutes we will leave to the many questions that have arrived from the audience. They started, in fact, questions started arriving yesterday. So I will start with the first question that I will pose to Jan Eliasson, which is related to what Nabil has just said. So it is how can international organizations, the system of international organizations, be refounded, and who can take the lead? Nabil talked about the Secretary General asking a group of wise people to advise him. Can you think of a drive led by a set of actors, state actors, non-state actors, innovative thinking? Who can do that? And how can we include, this is also a question, how can we include non-traditional security threats? You said Ebola. Of course, there is a Security Council resolution about Ebola. There is no Security Council, but this was a flexible interpretation of the mandate of the Security Council. How can we, first, do we have to put it in writing? And how can we do that? And what will be the position of the P5 in particular?
What I think we need to do is to put the realities in the center. We will have a world where pandemics will come back. We will have a huge issue of migration and refugees. We will have climate change, which takes pretty dramatic shape, both economically, socially, and politically. So these realities are there. And I am the first one to admit that the UN hasn't been up to it, very much because of the growing mistrust between the permanent members of the Security Council, most recently US and China, and where national ambitions certainly are much more important than international cooperation. Although I would say that China is trying to fill the vacuum that the US has left. I remember talking to Guterres before he started his job as Secretary General, visited China, and he came back and said, China is offering to pick up where US leaves on both peacekeeping and development programs. I noted that he didn't mention human rights, but still you have a China who wants to see that as an opening for increasing their influence. I would say that we need to have a much broader participation and inclusion process for the UN. It's not correct to just look at what governments do and what the international organization does. We have to go broader and wider, broader and deeper. We have to go to the private sector, we have to go to the civil society, we have to go to the scientific world, regional organizations, and putting the problem in the center and then seeing how we can contribute to solutions. This is the method to apply, not working in silos, which is a curse in bureaucracies, as Nabil knows, but rather go horizontal and to bring in the different actors that can influence. That's going to be crucial for dealing with these issues. On the Security Council, I would say that they urgently have to accept that security is broader than military issues. It's almost obscene. I, as chair of the board of SIPRI, came out with figures only this week. The military expenditure is $1,917 billion a year. $1,917 billion a year. And US takes up almost half of that, by the way. I mean, it's just a horrible situation in a world where we now are, on the brink of seeing the corona crisis hitting poor countries with poor care in hospitals, with no financial resources to start crisis programs, with water lacking for 800 million people, living 8 people in one room and so forth. if that hits, if that series goes as seriously in these countries as it's done in Italy, Spain, and UK, and US, I see also, then we have a hugely dramatic situation where I think we have to simply accept that we now live in a situation where international cooperation is absolutely necessary, and that we must find the form for it where it fits. And I think we have the United Nations. I would hope that this can be done by the UN. I think the 75th anniversary is built on the fact to mobilize on a broader and wider scale. We can't just sit and look at the UN being as the responsibility of somebody else. We are the UN.
Ibrahim, if I could be rude and interrupt, Americans are known for being rude. Two really quick comments. One is, with all due respect, nobody cares about the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. Right now, people care about not getting sick. They care about not getting unemployed. They care about not starving to death. That's a lot of money spent on military, I agree. Europe and North America, the United States, are gathering something on the order of $15 trillion. 15 trillion with a T right now, 1/3 of their GNP to spend in the next months on this crisis. That's both good news and bad news. The good news is we're demonstrating collectively, but individually, that we can in fact respond big to problems. 15 trillion is a lot of money, even in the 21st century. The other flip side of that is we're not going to do it twice. So unless we can inject a degree of urgency into this conversation about what world do we want, as they throw $15 trillion, they may be trying to cement the world that we've had backwards looking, rather than some kind of new world that meets the criteria that we might try to apply, or that the people in the room who are asking questions about global cooperation and blah, blah, blah might apply. I don't think this is next year's conversation or the year after conversation. $15 trillion being spent in the next months, what's going to be spent on, and is there a possibility for people, us, others, to influence that direction? Or will it just go to cement a system, distribution of income and wealth, how economy works, that is backward looking and not particularly relevant to the changes we all want?
Well, thank you, Alan. Let me convey to Ghassan Salamé one of the questions that I have received that relates to something I said at the very beginning about globalization. What globalization, what global relations, what functioning of the world economy, and with it, the norms that go with it, how do we expect this to be in the coming years? How will globalization shape up the globalization that would also be accepted to the power that is the United States? We have heard Alan say that globalization as it is now has many critics in the United States. What do you think? Where are we going?
Well, I think that the globalization process, which is now like 40-year-old at least in the present wave, this process, its contents are well known. Free markets, free passage of commodities, free more integration in the international financial system, investment-friendly legislation, etc. It's known. And it has produced extremely great effects and sometimes very negative ones as well. What is important is that if you look at the collateral effect of this globalization process, it's extremely diversified. And depending on where you are talking about, you have a completely different impact of the process. Let me take one example. In the most advanced countries of the world, globalization meant certainly more reliance on the international market, more financiarization of the economy. Okay, but it also meant a state withdrawal or a state retreat. But to the benefit of whom? To the benefit of the market, to the benefit of civil society, etc. If I look elsewhere, where we have seen a weakening of the state, in my part of the world and in other parts of the world, who won from the weakening of the state by the globalization process? Not the civil society. The civil society is often incivil. Not the market, because the market is not regulated, but savage. Therefore, those who won are armed groups. The state has weakened. We have seen the armed groups taking over. There are now 50 countries in the world where the state weakness has led to the strengthening of armed groups with different ideologies. It has led not to the empowerment of the civil society, but of communal and communitarist regrouping in tribes, cities, you name it. It hasn't led to a freer market, but to a more savage market. Therefore, the globalization itself, its dynamics are known, but its effect is not the same elsewhere. I don't see it producing the same kind of effect everywhere. It weakens the state, but the beneficiaries are very different if you look at Sweden, America, France, or the Arab countries or the African countries. It's very, very different, the real beneficiaries of the globalization process. That is why I believe that our main task in the few weeks to come is to really separate international cooperation that needs to be reinforced as soon as possible, especially in order to meet with the pandemics, from globalization, which has now a very bad reputation in many parts of the world. It brought 300 million or 400 million Chinese out of poverty, yes. But it led to the Gilets jaunes in France. It led to the weakening of the state structure almost everywhere in the third world.
Thank you very much, Ghassan. I would say that I would draw from that. You said that, in fact, you're calling for reinforced international cooperation to govern globalization differently than it has been governed so far. So I think
the World Trade Organization has been sterile in the past few. We are talking about the Security Council.
It has been paralyzed even. It has been paralyzed even. Yeah.
The World Trade Organization was not doing much better in the past few years.
So in fact, you're distinguishing between the process and the governance of globalization, and you call for international cooperation reinforced to govern globalization differently. Let me turn to Nabil Fahmy with several questions that I have about the consequences of what is happening at present and the possible refounding of the global order on the Middle East. How will this affect the Middle East? How would distribution of power be affected by the pandemics and the aftermath of the pandemics? And if we add in the Middle East the effects of the drop in oil prices, we can imagine a redistribution of power that may affect the eternal conflict that we've had in the region, the Arab-Israeli conflict, but other conflicts such as, of course, the all too familiar conflict to Ghassan Salamé, the conflict in Libya, or the conflict in Syria, or the conflict in Yemen. How will what happened affect distribution of power regionally, internationally, and by way of consequence, their impact on the conflicts? Unmute, Nabil, unmute. Nabil.
Okay.
Nabil.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Sure. Well, again, the first point is there was a geopolitical transformation ongoing even before COVID-19. And I'll give you just one specific example. The Russians were increasingly growing in Levant, but not as they were in the Soviet Union period. The Americans were saying they wanted either to pivot to Asia or to pivot out of the world towards America. So they were diminishing their interest in the region, mostly because of the difference in oil technology, but other things as well, because there was no big threat there. And over time, you were going to see an increased Chinese influence of a different kind, because the Chinese don't provide security assurances and so on as the Americans have in the past, but they will be looking for both oil and markets. So that was happening anyway. In the middle of all this disorder, we had 4 or 5 ongoing conflicts in the region, unresolvable for different reasons. The Libyan situation, the Palestinian-Israeli situation, the Syrian situation, the situation in Yemen, and the whole issue that Ghassan correctly mentioned, the non-state parties versus, in other words, militias and so on, versus state institutions, and I mentioned specifically here issues of terrorism. These were all ongoing and they were not getting solved, so things were extremely unstable. COVID-19, I don't think, definitely doesn't help the process, because everybody's distracted on that particular issue and the resources are there. I don't really think it increases or decreases the Chinese interest that much, or the American disinterest that much, or that of the Russians, although it may change the pace. And I think also it's just a little bit too early to draw geopolitical conclusions, because it depends whether in the Middle East or beyond, because it depends on how long we will face what we're facing. If this whole thing, and I don't believe this to be the case, if we go back to semi-normal in 6 to 10 to 12 months, we'll go back, regrettably, to a lot of what happened in the past. If it takes longer and the price is higher, then people will start to think more seriously. We cannot solve this and prevent a reoccurrence of this weak reaction to the crisis if we don't work collectively. Let me add a point here, however. I've always been frustrated that my own region has so many conflicts going on for so long, particularly the Palestinian-Israeli one, which has been going on for 70 years. But it is really a function of not respecting the rule of law, of following power politics rather than, if you want, the principles of the world order that we set so long ago. And to see the Secretary General's call for a ceasefire, I mean, I was on the one hand, I was very happy to hear it, but also, frankly, quite embarrassed to hear it at the same time. I was happy to hear it because the UN was speaking up, trying to stop warfare. But I was embarrassed because if the world can stop killing people because it faces a pandemic, why can't it stop killing people before the pandemic? So anyway, I'm not an idealist, regrettably not any longer. So I support the Secretary General's call for a ceasefire. I would love to see a ceasefire until next summer for the conflicts in the region, but provided it's also coupled with satellite images of where everybody's standing today and an intensive process of negotiations. Again, and it's not because I'm so committed to the UN, I actually think the best framework for negotiations, even for bilateral ones, is under the UN umbrella because it provides rule of law and provides legitimacy. So that's really where I look for this. There will be consequences to the changing order before COVID-19. This will make things much more difficult. I would love to see regional states, and I say this openly and proudly, it is time for regional states in the Middle East, particularly my own Arab brothers, to stand up, take positions about the future of the Middle East, and determine as much as they can where we're going rather than being reactive to others. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nabil. I think in your replies to questions, you have answered very many questions that were posed by the audience. We have 8 minutes left, so I will ask everyone from among you to speak for 2 minutes as a final intervention, a final comment on the whole discussion, on the entire discussion. So I will start by Jan Eliasson again. Jan.
Well, I can't refrain from commenting on my masochistic pleasure of having dealt with conflicts in the Middle East since the Iran-Iraq war in the early 80s, together with Olof Palme. I feel one of the most damaging phenomena in world politics, which I'm sure Ghassan can vouch for, is the fact that the proxy wars seem to be the rule of the day. I saw that in the Syria war when I fought at the side of Kofi Annan, Lakhdar Brahimi, Staffan de Mistura, and Geir Pedersen, where the battle was not between the part on the ground only. It was also regional powers, Iran and Saudi, Turkey, Qatar, and so forth. And then, of course, there was a complete problem, a great problem in the Security Council with Russia and the US. So proxy wars is a curse in world politics. Secondly, I think there is a grave need in the Middle East for a more stringent regional security culture structure, something which provides some type of break into a process that could very quickly turn into war. There has to be such a structure, particularly I would say around the Hormuz or Gulf or Persian Gulf area. Now, generally speaking, I think this has been a fantastic discussion. It's great to see my good friends being in such good shape as they are, and I was really inspired. But I think we have a choice. We have a choice now, and we should start thinking very actively on the choice. The choice is either whether we will turn inward and look backward, on the one hand, and on the other hand, whether we should turn outward and look to the future. I think if we adopt one of those formulas, and you see where my preference would be, then I think we should fill that with very pragmatic elements, many of them identified in this discussion, and make sure that we are better prepared for crisis, that we have a view of practical solidarity, and that we accept that we are sitting in the same boat, and that we have international cooperation as a national interest, I would say, in today's world. And that we should learn from the past, that we were ill-prepared, that we allowed too many gaps, and that we didn't see it coming, as is a very popular expression. But all the best for you for this type of discussion, and I think we, from Tällberg's side, I'm sure Alan will confirm this. We welcome this cooperation and look forward to future cooperation.
Thank you very much, Alan. Let me turn to, thank you very much, Ayan. Let me turn to Alan and ask him also for 2 minutes of last reflections.
Last reflection. I think we've talked too much about institutions and too little about people. This is, if there's ever been a moment where we need leadership, this is it. This is a time when we need leadership, and this is an ad for the Tällberg Foundation, that is global, leadership that is value-based, leadership that is innovative. And if we don't get that leadership, we're going to have the same damn conversation a year from now, except it'll be worse. So I think this is about, and it's something, Nabil, that you can do through GAPP. It's something, Jan, that we're trying to do through the Tällberg Foundation. We need to both encourage new kind of leaders to emerge. We need to help find them. We need to help nurture them. And if we don't, as I said, then I go from being a hopeful pessimist to I'll just be a plain old pessimist. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Ghassan Salamé, your last reflection?
Well, it is to say that it's a very strange crisis. And it's the first webinar I have accepted to join because I can refuse nothing to Nabil. The reality the reality is that it is the first crisis. I'm now 69. First crisis where I know very little about the culprit. Usually we deal with great powers, small powers, armed groups, terrorists, you name it, where we can explain their behavior and predict their behavior indeed. Now COVID-19, I don't know, and I have to rely entirely on a completely different discipline to tell me who he is and how he's going to evolve and how is he coming back or not. All this I don't know. The only similar situation in my career I had to face was Chernobyl, where also the enemy was unknown to me. There you needed physicists, and this time you need epidemiologists. But we are basically dealing with the symptoms, with the collateral effects, with the consequences of a crisis where we don't know the culprit, and we have to rely on others to tell us that. That pushes to more humility, and in practical terms, to more cooperation among various disciplines in understanding the crises of the future. I think the crises of the future will look much more like the one we are dealing with than with the ones we have been dealing with in the past 30 or 40 years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ghassan. Nabil, last reflection.
Thank you, Ibrahim. Very, very quickly, what we faced is a clear message that either we work together or we will all suffer the consequence. Let me add here that if you look at the economic consequence so far, strangely enough, the expectations for 21 are that advanced economies will lose more percentage-wise in GDP growth than emerging markets. Of course, losing that much in emerging markets hurts more, but in essence, it shows you that economic wealth does not defend you or secure you from these kinds of threats. It also is a lesson for, it teaches us humility. We are less powerful than we actually think, because there are things in globalization we have not yet. We need to work together. And I would close by saying, SIPRI has always been my source for arms control data, but you really should have skipped that 1,917,000,000, because that really makes me feel embarrassed that I'm a human being. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nabil. I think you have been so clear that I don't need really to conclude or to make any summary of or draw conclusions from the discussions. I will thus just repeat what Ghassan Salamé has said, that he doesn't know, and in fact nobody knows. Nobody knows because, of course, sources of threats are different. Chernobyl, the coronavirus, these are new threats, global threats that require this new global governance that you call for. I suggest to all of you, and to Nabil in particular, that we come back a year from now. Maybe we will know better.
Yeah.
And we can reflect on what will have happened during this year. And I think it will be quite interesting to see the contrast between May 8th, by the way, no, it's May 7. May 7, one day before May 8. May 7, 2020, and May 7, 2021. Yes, Nabil.
Let me just move your suggestion slightly. If you will moderate, and my colleagues on the panel are ready to do this, I'd be happy to do it. But I really would one-up you. If we are over COVID-19, I'll invite you all to Cairo at my expense to do this live.
And we've got 200 witnesses, done.
Yes, I know.
Well, thank you very much to all of you, to the four of you, but we also need to thank the audience, numerous audience that was as global as the participants, as the panelists. We've had audience from Lebanon, Sweden, Spain, Mexico, Chile, the United States, Algeria, so many countries, and some certainly others that I couldn't pick up. So thank you all of the audience, and thank you the panelists, and thanks again to the Tällberg Foundation for co-organizing this Tahrir dialogue with GAPP.
Thank you.
Good evening to all of you.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.